Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lisa Stutz, the director of the Royal Gorge Regional Museum History Center. This morning, our amazing volunteer, Terri Meeks, will be talking about railroad research. But before I turn it over to Terri, I just wanted to go over a few general housekeeping notes and some announcements. If you have any questions or comments you would like to share during the program, please type them in the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat box throughout the program, and we will make sure all of your questions get addressed at the end of the presentation. If you would like to test that feature now, please type hello so we know that you can hear us. We also want to invite you to join us this coming Friday, November 18th at 9 a.m. for our community coffee and conversation at the museum. You can enjoy free coffee and donuts and share your memories of old businesses and buildings in the area, like Jeannie's Chili Wagon or the Ranch House. We are very interested in hearing about some of those stories. You can also catch us next week on Carol Ann's Morning Line this coming Thursday at 8:30. We will be talking about other historic buildings downtown and in the surrounding area. Our next virtual genealogy program with Terri won't be until January due to the holidays. The museum will be posting the online registration for that program as it gets closer, so please stay tuned. And again, thank you so much for joining us, and I will now turn it over to Terri.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're going to dive into some railroad records, and these might be some of the hardest records that cause you the most work to do in trying to find your ancestor, the railroad that they might have worked for, and what type of position that they held. The results may also not yield as much family genealogical information that you might wish to find, but they're still worth the trial. So let's think about the history of railroads here in the United States. The first railroads started out as gravity roads, and as early as 1764. They really didn't have an engine. They just relied on the downhill force of gravity. So these railroads were built on slopes, and they were usually used for either mining or military purposes. From the mine perspective, they would load their stone, their coal, or whatever the mineral was into the cars, and then float it downhill on the gravity force road. There is some controversy as to what the first railroads were. And the controversy stems around the fact that a railroad requires a rail. And these gravity roads did have rails. Here's a picture from much later on, a century and a half later, but it is a Pennsylvania gravity railroad. And when the cars all got down to the bottom of the hill and were unloaded, they usually used animal power or a stationary machine engine to haul the cars back up the hill, refill, and then repeat the process. As settlers decided to move westward and the economy increased, there was a need for more methods of transportation. They had to move people. Number one, they wanted the settlers to be able to move to new land. And once they got there, they wanted to be able to ship goods to these people and to receive goods from the settlers, whether it be farm crops or actual manufactured goods. So the first methods of transportation were along roads, and they established toll roads and turnpikes first. The easiest method of transportation was water, and that is still true today. So they used steamships along the navigable rivers. Then we see the construction of canals. These were smaller waterways, and in many cases, narrower waterways that allowed for the transportation of goods as well as people. And many of the railroads also derive from canal companies. They used the same routes and built the railroad parallel to the canal. So we then see the introduction of railroads. Excuse me. In 1797, we have the first steam locomotive, but that was in England. So we have to make sure that it's going to be much later that they're going to be introduced in the United States. By 1810, we have the 3/4 mile horse-drawn Leaper Railroad. And it was constructed on oak rails that were laid on blocks that were 8 feet apart. And I do have a brief picture of the Leaper Railroad. It was a family-built railroad. Mr. Leaper could not get the land right of way to build the canal that he wanted. So instead, he built the 3/4 mile railroad. Thank you. It was the first chartered railroad in the United States. It was the first operational non-temporary railroad. So it was a permanent structure. And it was also the first well-documented railroad constructed. So from then, by short 15 years later, we get the Granite Railroad, opened in Quincy, Massachusetts, and it was 3 miles long. The following year, the Baltimore and Ohio was chartered. And we see the first steam-powered rail passenger service, which began in South Carolina. And I actually have a picture from that. Here's a picture of the Leaper Railroad. We note that there are the wooden rails and supposedly with supports 8 feet apart. And I believe the caption of this picture had said something about it was a library function, but it's a horse-drawn, similar to a stagecoach, but on a much larger scale. That Charleston Railroad, the first friend of Charleston, is currently on exhibit in Charleston, and it's our first steam-powered passenger train. The Strasburg Railroad came about in 1832, and it is still in business today. It is the oldest continually operating standard gauge railroad. It is also the oldest public utility in Pennsylvania, but today it operates simply as a tourist train and provides excursions for people. Here's a photo back from 1894 of the Strasburg Railroad, and they still use some of the original engines and cars in their tourist operation. So once railroads got a foothold in the nation, the expansion exploded. We can see in just a few short decades how the number of miles covered by railroads and their tracks literally exploded. The Civil War became a major influence in the Civil War because they had to move troops and, more importantly, supplies in a relatively quick manner. So railroads became very, very important to the war. And just after the Civil War started the golden age of railroads. People used them on a regular basis. And by 1916, we have over 200,000 miles of rail tracks. And we've seen a decline in recent years in railroads. We have seen many of these the rail beds turned into bike paths and other recreational activities. So what kind of employment was offered by the railroads? Virtually all aspects. We tend to think of the conductor or the ticket agent or the engineer working on the railroads. But before the railroad could be built, surveying teams were sent out to explore, and there was also the acquisition of land. So railroad employees might have participated in that. There's the actual construction and continued maintenance of rail beds, rail tracks, as well as the engines and cars. So we have numerous occupations falling in that category. We do have the operation, the ticket sales, etc. There, if there's a dining car, we have chefs and cooks, and we also have all the administrative roles, the presidents of the companies. So if one of your people happen to have worked for the railroad, they may have worked for the actual railroad company itself, or they might have been hired as a contractor, in which case their records will not be found most likely in railroad records. Employment with the railroad was a steady job. In some cases, it was a dangerous job, but it provided opportunities for people to have spend their entire career working on or for the railroad. In many cases, people had to move with the work. They might not have been stationed in one particular location. They might have had to move along with their family as the railroad progressed. One of the first resources to look at for railroad records is the U.S. Railroad Retirement Board. It is a federally administered retirement plan, very similar to Social Security. And in fact, we'll see how the two are related. The restriction for this is that the Railroad Board came about just shortly after Social Security in 1935. The other restriction is that your family member had to be employed by railroads in general for over 10 years. So this makes looking for records, especially old records, very, very limited. If they were not in the Railroad Board's records, then you're going to have to try and figure out which actual railroad they worked for. As we said, the Railroad Board started in the mid-30s, and they began maintaining the records the following year in 1936. If you look at a Social Security death index, you might see the Social Security numbers in the 700 series up through the 728 series. These are unique numbers that automatically tell you that your ancestor worked for the railroad and that they did have information at the Railroad Retirement Board. From that website, you can actually order a search of the records, which currently costs $27. So you want to check online first to see if perhaps there is a file for your people, and we'll talk about that before sending off for the information. The railroad records from the Retirement Board, after they are inactive for a period of 7 years, they get sent to the National Archives in Atlanta. And these records do primarily deal with the payment of benefits, but you may also find applications, training, performance records, etc. For the most part, though, it is going to deal with the payment of benefits. And we'll look at an example of what you might see there. The person has to be deceased. So and here again, the file has to be inactive for a period of 7 years. And to get a copy of the file, NARA does charge 80 cents per page. Here is an application for a widow's insurance annuity. And we see that Eleanor Hoff, her husband Edward, was the railroad employee. And we see that unique Social Security number, the 715 series. We do get his birth date, where he was born in New Jersey, and he died in 1962 in Florida. It's interesting, he did move around during his occupational period. So the records may involve anywhere between those states. He could have also retired earlier since this is a widow's request. And the following page requires a lot of information about their marriage and the two parties and their freedom to enter into the marriage. I found it really, really interesting that such a personal level was asked to be certified. So a lot of information about the marriage and the state in which they contracted their marriage. And was the person legally capable of entering into a valid marriage? So they were really specific on this. When Eleanor died, we find a copy of the Railroad Retirement Board returned check notice. So at this point, we see that she's getting $172.09, and we get a month, day, and a year. So it helps narrow down when Eleanor passed away. So if your people did not serve for 10 years with the railroad, or they were prior to the 1936 timeframe, we need to figure out what railroad they might have worked for. And we'll go through some of the tools that might be available to you. The first question to ask is, where did your ancestor live? If you've looked at your census records and you see that your person is actually listed as a railroad worker, look at exactly where they're living at that particular point in time. The census records in some of the later years might actually list the name of the railroad rather than just simply stating that he was a railroad worker. So you want to try and check county histories as well, or city directories. City directories will also contain the information about where your ancestor worked, as well as what railroads might have serviced their particular area. One of the chief tools in doing this is to look at railroad maps. The Library of Congress has an extensive collection of simply railroad maps that date from as early as 1828. So that's one of your key places to turn to. Here is an example on the left of a railroad map of the state of Alabama. And the key is very small, but we see railroads going in parallel lines throughout the state. I've blown up a section so that we see that we have the actual label. We have the Alabama and Florida Railroad. We have the Girard Railroad. Also, there's the Northeastern and Southwestern Railroad. There's the Alabama and Tennessee Railroad. So if your people were from Alabama and lived anywhere along those lines, you might check those actual railroads to see if there's information about your ancestor. This is from 1866, so it's very early on. Here is an Arizona railroad map, and it has a key that tells us the years in which these railroads were actually constructed. The different colored lines and dotted lines represent the different years that the railroads were constructed. Unfortunately, it doesn't give us any specific railroad names, but with this information from the map, you can do further research. There are also maps for specific railroads. The red line is the line of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and we see all the towns that grew up along the railroad line. We also see that there are some tributary line railroads as well. So if you find a name of a railroad, you might look specifically for its route. Here in Colorado, we have the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, and we see the numerous paths that it took as it developed. There is also a biographical directory of railroad officials. These were volumes very, very similar to Who's Who in America that were published between 1885 and 1922. They do, for the most part, cover mid and senior level employees. But if your ancestor had a long railroad career, they might have been promoted to one of these mid-level positions. So don't overlook these. They are in alphabetical order, and they are available on Google Books for free, and you can explore them. Here is a page from one of these volumes, and we see the various occupations from a superintendent to a vice president, a car accountant. So occupations that we may never have heard of that we're going to require further exploration. An assistant general superintendent, a secretary, an attorney for the railroad. So think outside the box. Your people may have not had what we think of as a traditional job. Here's a freight agent, and it gives some biographical information. Much of the information concerns the railroad history for each of the people. When did they start their employment? What were their promotions? Where did they move to? But it does give some general information: born in 1876 and where they were born. He graduated from Purdue University. So you may find information that you had not previously known. Here's a following page. Here's a passenger agent, a chief engineer, a freight traffic manager, a superintendent of machinery. So all kinds of different occupations to be explored. When these volumes ceased in 1922, they were taken over by who's who in railroading. And they, in the similar fashion, they do have the short biographical sketches. And 1971 was the latest edition that I was able to find. And unfortunately, I was not able to find anything that I could actually peruse. But know that the volumes do exist, and through a library WorldCat search, you might be able to come across who's who in railroading. It brings us to books. Don't overlook the possibility of books for your family. If they worked on the Transcontinental Railroad, even if your person's name is not mentioned in the book, reading the book will give you an idea of what actually occurred during the construction of the railroad. What was society like at the time? What were the kinds of jobs that were available in there? And it will give you a great history lesson as far as the movement westward during that time. Depending on your native ancestry, there are individual books. The forgotten World War II story of Mexican workers in the US West. Who knew? I did not know anything about this, and I'm actually interested in trying to get a hold of this book. There are also books written about the individual railroad lines that might give you further information about them. We see, and this is where things get really, really complicated. We've got the Louisville and Nashville Railroad Company and the roads in its system. And each one of those has a different name. They're on branches and divisions. And it gives the length of each one of these sets of tracks. So knowing that the parent company of these individual divisions might help you to find information about your specific relative. It's going to take work. Railroads change their names. They merged. We see the complicated names of Burlington Northern and Santa Fe. They merged, the Burlington Northern Railroad and the Santa Fe Railroad. So we see name changes through the decades. And as we've seen in most recent years, a lot of the railroads no longer exist. So when finding information about your ancestor, the quality of the paperwork is going to depend on the individual railroad, as well as the quantity. Very little has been indexed or made available. So this is going to take some real research. And we're going to look at where you might find some clues to help you find some of these records. In many cases, actual personnel records are scanty. You may be fortunate enough to find some that are extremely detailed, but those details are going to be about their performance in the railroad and not necessarily family history related information. If you go to the Ancestry catalog and enter railroads, you will see a relatively long list of opportunities to search. Some of them also include international railroads, railroads in England, for example. Here is that index. It's not the actual records, it's just the index for your people that might have worked for the Railroad Retirement Board. And they do have over 1 million files. But we see individual employment cards, employment records, personnel files for different railroads across the country with either limited numbers or significant numbers. They're all worth looking at. Here is an example from Ancestry for the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. It's an employment record. Simple. It's not even the original record. It is an extraction. It is also very recent. Sandra was born in 1947, so she might even still be alive. And she was hired in January of 1974 as a key punch operator in Chicago. So possibility she may be in, at this point, in the Railroad Retirement Board system. With the same railroad, we do see a card very similar to a Social Security application card. Here again, we note the unique number in the 720 series, and we do get exactly which railroad he was working for, where he was working, what the occupation was, and we get his parents' names. For the same railroad, but a little bit different format, we do see an actual pension record for Ethelbert Jones. He was a locomotive engineer, and he worked in the Galena division of the railroad, the Chicago and Northwestern. And we get his birth date, how long he served, 36 years and 4 months in the railroad, and what his average pay was, when his pension was granted, and when he actually started collecting. And he only got $31 a month in his allowance. In some others, you might find an actual personnel file. Unfortunately, this was stapled along the top and folded over. So when they actually performed the scan, they didn't get the person's name. I do believe in the extracting of the record to make the file, they did have it recorded, but it is a Mr. Smith because we get his wife's name, and he had a 3-year-old son at the time. He was born in 1905, and this actual document comes from 1928. And he has applied for a job, and he is going to be hired as a student brakeman. So he's potentially in 1928, at the age of 23, beginning his career in the railroad industry. This one was shocking to me. This is a 1919 payroll record, and we do get the names of the various people that worked, for the railroad at the time, and we get their job categories, the number of hours that they worked in a 2-week period of time. So we're seeing that many of these people exceeded, in fact, other than the one, all of them exceeded a 40-hour a week. But what was shocking to me was they were earning 50 cents an hour, 43 cents an hour. And this is 1919, but I didn't realize that salaries would be that low. So we see for the 2-week period of time what they were earning, and were they paying anything else? Were they buying Liberty bonds? And I regret to say that I do not know. I have not investigated what these individual initials stand for. But these were deducted from their pay, and this was what they took home. It was regular employment, and it did provide opportunity. And the actual check numbers for the payroll. This is another record that I found for the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe. And we see that Mr. Johnson, who has a Social Security number in our series, we find out that he was born in 1898 in Illinois, was handwritten in afterwards. And we see what his employment, he was employed as a brakeman, and then finally as a conductor in 1942. The divisions of the railroad that he actually worked in. But you'll notice in terms of his performance, he's working for a month, he's working for 2 months, 2 months, 3 months, with spaces in between. We have supposedly a force reduction, and we're going to find out a little bit more on the second page. Always look for more. Don't be satisfied with the first page that you find. We've got demerits and reprimands, and we see in 1938 that he has received 10 demerits for shoving a car over, and something about derailing, attempting to spot outfit on track, protected by portable derail. He had 4 months of a clear record. That's pretty discouraging, actually. And then he has more demerits. And not being where he could be located. So they had to call in someone else to perform his job. Clear record. He was not available for his call. Finally, 4 months of a clear record. And something about sleeping on call. So Mr. Johnson was not exactly your ideal employee, and you need to look for more. Family Search has more historical type records about railroads. They don't have actually lists of employees, and they have many, many occurrences of accidents. And here again, when it talks about employees, we do see international information. So depending on when your ancestor might have immigrated, you might be interested in exploring some of those and know that your railroad employee might have worked in a foreign country. I'm going to pause on this particular slide so that you can either copy the information for the website or take an actual screen print of this particular slide, because this particular resource is very valuable. It is, if you click on the link, the listing of research resources, you notice that it is a relatively recent, only a little over a year old version. It is a PDF document. It is 39 pages long, and it is relying on contributions from numerous other people that have collected information about railroad records, railroad employment, etc. So it is a valuable resource, and he does provide additional links within this document so that you can actually, you can't search by name, but you can search by time period. This is just the beginning of this 39-page listing. And we see that he starts with like Amtrak, National Railroad Passenger Corporation, and he has a link to a RootsWeb site. In other cases, it might be to an educational library, and it gives the time period as well as what might be in the collection. And here we have employee rosters, for example. So there's 39 pages of this information. I just happened to click on this particular one, the Amtrak, and it gave me additional time frames to look at. I chose 1983, and we just get simply retirements. So we see that, for example, on February 28th of 1983, that Edward Arms, he was the manager of locomotive heavy maintenance, and he retired in 1983. So it gives you an idea, working backwards, of he was retiring, when he might have started his career in the railroads. We have different areas where these people have retired, and that will give you an idea also of where they might have served. Here's ticket accounting clerk, a service attendant, a baggage man. So we see not only your mid and upper level employees, but we get those that are working on a day-to-day basis on the trains themselves. So this is a website that is very useful in trying to determine your railroads, etc. Magazines, and this one happens to be an online magazine. The Frisco was a train that ran from St. Louis to San Francisco, and it was in operation from 1878 as currently as 1980. And in 1980, it was absorbed by the Burlington Northern Railroad. But here again, this is a wonderful website. It's got the lines that formed it, postcards, the depots, but they have employee cards. They have issues of the employee magazine. So like the Social Security cards, very much like them, the employee cards, you enter a surname or if you know the whole name into the search engine. I just went simply with Smith and chose one. Here's an Adrian Edred Smith. The actual Social Security number has been blocked out, but we do see he's working for the St. Louis to San Francisco Railway, where he is actually working and what his position is, where he was born, who his parents were, and if he has previously worked for a government agency, where that might have been. He worked on the pipeline in Bartlesville, Oklahoma in 1939. We have another one, and this gentleman is a clerk from working in Springfield, Missouri for this particular railroad, his birth date, who his parents are. So if you're researching collateral lines, sometimes these cards will help you as well. Railroad museums. Practically every state has some form of railroad museum, but the National Park Service does also have a Steamtown National Historic Site in Pennsylvania, and they are in the process of building a database for those people that worked for the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. So a railroad that serviced that particular area of Pennsylvania. But if your people weren't in Pennsylvania or didn't work for that railroad, check out the state railroad museums. Many of them will have actual train engines, train parts, but some of them will also have collected personnel records or other information that might give you information about your particular ancestor. In many cases, just take the time to investigate what their holdings are so that you might find some of your lucky ancestors. Employee rosters do exist. They may include seniority dates and positions. There are actually two types of rosters: official ones, which are generated by the railroad, and then there are advertising rosters, which were privately published. The availability varies by the railroad, and of course, what's contained in them will vary widely as well. Here is an employee roster for the Big Five Northwest Railroad employees. And it is a simple alphabetical listing last name, first name, what their position was, what part of the railroad system were they working for, and the division in which they worked. Their seniority numbers, and when they actually entered service, and were they promoted at different times to different positions. There are also timetables, information about the Railroad Express Agency, railroad guides, and maps. Some of these will not give personal information, but will give other types of information surrounding railroad work. Here is a listing, for example, of what they have. Some of the information dates from early to more modern times. And we see all different kinds of information. We've got California, we've got Iowa, and the Chesapeake and Ohio. So different sets. And here again, this collection is larger than just this page. So for example, there are public timetables. These were company publications, and they may give the name of the station or the traffic department personnel. And these were used for sales purposes for the most part. But if your ancestor happens to be in there, and here again, you can't sort by name, it's one of those where you're going to have to look page by page and scan each one to see if perhaps your person might have been listed. There are timetables, employee timetables, and this is information that mostly pertains to the railroad and the operation of the railroad at a given period of time. If your person worked for the railroad, this would be good background information to have as to what they might have done or experienced on the day-to-day operation. There really is not much personnel information in this. And here is one, for example, and it talks about what rail lines were working and what things had to be shutted off to other divisions, what rules applied to certain lines, trains register by ticket. So a lot of information about the day-to-day operation that would help the employee to perform his job. In a similar fashion, there are some Railroad Express records. In this one, talking about diverting from one line to another line. Very little personnel information. There are railroad guides. Most of them include advertising, but they do contain large indexes of railroads, the principal routes, the stations, the connections. And as I mentioned very, very early on, many of the railroads came about as a result of canals and steamboats. And they maintained those connections with steamboats. Also, personal travel and connections with freight trains. So here is, for example, an index to railroads. And we see that there are hundreds of them, even as early as 1853. But this might help you narrow down where your relative might have worked at that particular time. In addition, they do include maps, and this map just happens to be of the streetcar system. So here again, it was on a rail. So the streetcars were on a rail. So it's doing a local streetcar mapping. Don't overlook labor union magazines. Locomotive engineers had a union. Railroad conductors had a union. And some of these volumes are available on Google Books and you can peruse them. So, and they may include reports of injuries or deaths of families that were within families. So who's receiving those benefits? And we see from the cover, this is the Happy New Year cover. And I'm sitting there going, okay, it looks like we've got a widow here. So I'm not sure how happy that particular occasion is. We can't skip over the influence in the Southwest here of the Fred Harvey Company and his contribution to the railroad industry. Fred Harvey was an immigrant from England who worked in New York City as a dishwasher in a restaurant. And he made his way to Topeka, Kansas by 1876. And he saw the burgeoning of the railroad system and decided that perhaps trains needed to provide food for those people that were traveling. And rather than putting, or in addition to putting food on the trains, he set up lunchrooms. And he worked with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe on simply a handshake, but he contracted to open a series of restaurants along their route. He wanted to guarantee that they could have good food in a short period of time. And this also influenced the railroad in that they had to provide stops in these locations with that 30-minute interval so that people could be served their food. Passenger trains were on the go. And so he opened his first eating establishment in 1878. He eventually spanned to 15 states from Topeka westward to California and had over 60 locations. He specialized in what he called fine dining, luxury lodgings, and later on, not initially, he did have guided tours of locations so people could actually stop, stay overnight, and continue on their train journey. He provided a valuable service during World War II in providing food for troops traveling across the country. And at one point, he was the 6th largest food retailer in the United States, kind of the forerunner of Howard Johnson's, but along railroad lines. He took extra time and energy to make sure that he was providing good food and that his employees were presented in a good and refined fashion. Here's a map from the New Mexico State Historical Museum that just shows some of the stops along the way within New Mexico. Part of the system. Here in Colorado, there were Harvey houses in, I believe it was Lamar, and I know there was one in Trinidad. And I think that there was one also in Colorado Springs. This is the Castaneda Hotel in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and it was originally a Harvey house. The train station is sitting over here on the east side, and they're still open today. And as I mentioned, he did have tours. This is, I believe, from the Castaneda Hotel, and it is a 1920 tour, and I believe this is Fred Harvey himself. Besides serving a good meal, one of the things that he prided himself on were his Harvey girls, the women that would actually be serving the food. He hired single women between the ages of 18 and 30, and they had to be of good moral character, and they had to have at least an 8th grade education. And Will Rogers quipped that Fred Harvey kept the West in food and wives. When trying to look for these records in the census, you will see a number of young females listed working in railroads. And these women probably were Harvey girls. There was a Judy Garland movie about the Harvey girls, and they are famous. Here are some of the uniforms that they were required to wear. And there is an actual employee list of all of the people that worked for the Harvey Company, with their names, what types of occupations they performed, where they were stationed, and the years of their employment and where the information originally came from. So don't overlook the women as well. They might have been Harvey girls. So with that, I will bring it to a close for today. And I see that we have a question.
Yes, Terry, actually, I have this question. If you go back to that, one of those old maps that show the railroad lines, but you had the parallel lines on either side of the railroad track,
Okay.
was that considered railroad land that when they got the right of way for the railroad, they also got those sections of land that they later sold off for towns or for farms? Is that what that map was depicting?
I don't think so. That the map that you're referring to is from the state of Alabama. And I think from the scale of the size of the map that there would be too much land
Well,
involved.
that's why I asked the question, because it was very, very wide right away, it looked like.
Right. I think it's too wide to be that. There was a key at the bottom of the map that did show what those other parallel lines were. And I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what. I apologize.
No,
I will get back to you with an answer.
You know where I live, right?
I do.
The reason I ask is because a lot of those railroad right-of-ways are still intact.
Yes.
And that's where they have maintained ownership of some old abandoned lines. And now they're walking trails for communities, but it still belongs to the railroad. So in the future, they could actually re-implement an active line.
Yes. that is true. And certain sections of land were actually set aside by the government for railroad access. They knew with the development of the West that and the development of railroads that they would need to have that. So the government did set aside some sections of land specifically for railroad construction.
Okay,
So-
thank you.
Well, with that, we will conclude this morning's. And as Lisa mentioned at the front of the program, that we will be doing some research on collateral lines in January, what the cousins have to say. Not only do you need to research your direct line, you need to look at all those aunts, uncles, and cousins as well. So I wish you all a happy holiday season, and we'll see you again in January. Thank you.